where you see the passing of time.
The crowds in St. Peter's Square are praying like mad for the Pope's life.
Where moments refuse to die.
This is a momentous hour in world history. This is the invasion of Hitler's Europe.
And where victory lives on.
Plenty of girls are being kissed by plenty of boys they don't know, and they do not care.
You can love it, hate it, embrace it, or turn away.
Lenin was shot to death late last night outside his apartment building.
But it is a past we all share.
Come on out here and give me a salute. Big Navy salute.
This is where yesterday has a home, where we wonder what it was like back then.
Go forward, knights, in safety.
And not too long ago.
His spirit must live on.
It's where history has its place and where the past comes alive. The History Channel.
When I was a boy in New York City during the Depression, strikes were part of everyday life. The garment workers, the taxi drivers, the elevator operators, slow-downs, walkouts, sit-downs, you name it. Working people were fed up and joining unions. And for the first time in history, what they were doing was legal. Franklin Roosevelt had pushed through laws that guaranteed the right to organize and bargain collectively. And all of this was a huge shock to big business. Conflict was inevitable. The picket line was not the only place where people were punching back. It was the age of the great bank robbers, like Pretty Boy Floyd, who could barge into a bank and leave with thousands of dollars, even if he needed a gun to do it. Come with me now to a place and time when justice seemed upside down, just like the topsoil of Oklahoma and Texas, which hung in great black clouds over the Dust Bowl. When the economy went to pieces and dust clouds blanketed the land, most people hunkered down and made do.
We were all living, scratching and clawing like the third monkey on Noah's gangplank just to get by.
If the Depression wasn't any of your doing, you felt anger. And sometimes you fought back.
Everybody was saying, enough is enough. Let's do something in this country. People gotta live, people gotta eat.
But rebellion means bloodshed and the terrible wrath of a wounded society.
You don't want to stick a bayonet at nobody, but if it's necessary, you might have to.
A battle was being waged over the country's future. Outlaw against G-Man. Black versus white. Striker versus cop. America was at war with itself. In the Cookson Hills of eastern Oklahoma lies a town named Sallisaw. It's a place rich with history, both real and imagined. John Steinbeck made Sallisaw the home of the fictional Joad family in The Grapes of Wrath. This is Indian country, rebel country.
These were people who were the sons and daughters and grandchildren of vanquished Confederate soldiers, old Johnny Reb. They were Native Americans who had been moved in here at the point of bayonet, some of them, the ancestors of people who came down the trails of tears of the 5 tribes dumped in this land. This was a land of vanquished people.
Sallisaw, Oklahoma was no stranger to hard times, but it hadn't seen anything quite like the Depression. The banks failing, the cotton crash.
Everybody just went broke here. Cotton went down to nothing. My grandpa Amos, he give his away to somebody to pick it. And what he had already had ginned, he held it, thought he'd get more, and it kept going down and going down.
It was a place of natural and man-made calamity whose most famous son was this man, Charles Arthur Pretty Boy Floyd. Around Sallisaw, they called him Chalk, which was the name of his favorite beer. In the 20s, he was already something of a rebel. He refused to pick cotton.
He was tired of his hands bleeding, literally bleeding from picking cotton, from hoeing cotton, from going out in those endless, monotonous fields of cotton.
There weren't many alternatives to picking cotton that were legal. Floyd landed in the Missouri State Pen on a 5-year sentence for armed robbery. When he was paroled in 1929, he tried to go straight. Floyd became a roustabout in an Oklahoma oil field until his past caught up with him.
That sticks in my mind. The farm boss, Pike McGee, fired him. But then, when you have been in prison, you're automatically fired. He had no income, and he went from bad to worse.
Floyd turned to bank robbery and finally found something he was good at. In 1931, he knocked off 8 banks in just 2 months. Pretty Boy's nephew, Bain, remembers a visit after one clean getaway.
I saw the money that night spilled out on the bed. The silver just made the bed sag. Much of it. I wished I'd have got a 50-cent piece or something out of that, kept it. But I can remember they had piles of silver.
In any other time, Pretty Boy Floyd would have been just another bank robber, too ornery or too lazy to eke out a living in the cotton and oil fields. But in the perverse moral climate of the Great Depression, desperados like Floyd became folk heroes.
Every time we have a depression in this country, we have a crop of social bandits appear. Men and women who give the disenfranchised, the downtrodden, a chance to punch back. Bonnie and Clyde, Babyface Nelson, Machine Gun Kelly, and certainly Pretty Boy Floyd.
In the Cookson Hills, a legend grew around the good-looking gunman. People said he ripped up mortgages at the banks that he robbed and left $20 bills under his supper plate at many a poor farmer's house.
He knew how to live off the countryside and find goodwill with these people who were looking for a champion, who were looking for a hero, who were looking for some damn hope. And they could turn to Charlie Floyd. Pretty boy, he's out there. He robbed that bank. Well, that bank foreclosed on my daddy's farm. He got money from them. Yeah. Put a tally up there for Charlie Floyd, for Pretty Boy. He struck back for us.
November 1st, 1932 was a homecoming of a bizarre sort for Charles Arthur Floyd. Floyd was back in Sallisaw, aiming to rob his hometown bank.
He walked right into that bank and robbed a bank that had foreclosed on a lot of those people, and it meant a lot to them.
Floyd disappeared into the Cookson Hills with $2,400. If the money weren't yours, you'd probably have loved it.
A lot of people in Oklahoma would say hooray. They clapped their hands when somebody robbed a bank. My uncle made them clap their hands too often.
In the flash of a gunshot, people started to change their minds about Pretty Boy Floyd. In Bixby, Oklahoma, Floyd gunned down a former sheriff and bounty hunter named Irv Kelly, the third lawman that Floyd was said to have killed. Even his admirers had a hard time explaining the body count.
Too fast, too far. Well, he shouldn't have done it to start with. He made up his mind to live like the rest of us. We made it. He could have made it.
But it was a notorious crime that probably wasn't even his. That was Floyd's undoing. It happened at Kansas City's Union Station on June 17, 1933. In the parking lot, lawmen were getting ready to return a fugitive to prison. 3 men suddenly appeared and opened fire in a botched attempt to free the inmate. The gunmen killed 5 people, including a G-man, one of the first to die in the line of duty. Though most historians now agree that Pretty Boy had nothing to do with the crime, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover pinned it on him. After the Kansas City massacre, FBI agents were authorized to carry firearms and to make arrests anywhere in the country. It was the beginning of the end for Depression-era bandits. In July 1934, FBI agents led by Melvin Purvis gunned down John Dillinger outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago. With Dillinger in his grave, Purvis was assigned to get Pretty Boy Floyd. Floyd seemed safe as long as he stayed out of the Cookson Hills. With his girlfriend and his accomplice, a man named Adam Richetti, he hid out for almost a year in Buffalo, New York. But then Floyd got homesick for Oklahoma. He and Richetti were on their way back when their car broke down near Wellsville, Ohio. In a gun battle with local police, Richetti surrendered, but Pretty Boy escaped and fled into a forest. 2 days later, G-men tracked Floyd to this farm near East Liverpool, Ohio. As he fled across a cornfield, Floyd was taken down by a sharpshooter. Several more bullets were pumped into him as he died. Some say it was overkill by the angry lawmen.
That's something that I knew since I was 10 years old, that Melvin Purvis had my uncle executed in the cornfield after he was knocked down. I guess that's just as well that it ended right there, because he didn't want to go back to prison.
Pretty Boy Floyd had one last grand homecoming. His funeral on October 28, 1934, was the largest in Oklahoma history.
That tells you something. People didn't have jobs. They didn't have to go to work. They're going to a funeral.
They was up in trees over there trying to take pictures and things. They guarded the grave there for a day or two, maybe a week. Afraid somebody dig him up and haul him off, I guess.
For the people of Sallisaw, the mourning period was cut short by other worries. The same year they buried Pretty Boy, the rain stopped. Life-giving topsoil was baked into dust, and to the west, whipped into towering, suffocating dust storms. The dust clouds drifted as far east as Sallisaw, but the town suffered mostly from blazing heat and crippling drought.
Everything burned up. It didn't rain from early spring till fall. All this stuff just dried up.
It was so hot, grasshoppers just came out of the ground, big ones, and they just went moving across fields. They were eating everything in their path that was green.
Many people simply gave up on Sallisaw, packing everything they owned into their Model Ts and heading west, like Steinbeck's fictional Joad family. Others stayed and somehow endured.
Out of the Depression and Dust Bowl came a word that's really a badge of courage, not a badge of shame. That's Okie. Okie. These were resilient people.
A world away from the Dust Bowl was Harlem in New York City. But Harlem and Sallisaw had something in common. Both were among the places hit worse by the Great Depression, and both were places where people were striking back. The Harlem Renaissance, it was called, when the literary lions roared, the giants of jazz reigned, and the place to be was north of 110th Street. During the 1920s, there were new voices coming out of Harlem. Writers like Langston Hughes took the black experience and made it every man's. Magnetic entertainers like Cab Calloway pulled audiences from Park Avenue to 142nd Street for a little razzmatazz. But if you were black, you couldn't get into the Cotton Club except with an instrument. The good times of the Renaissance masked a harsher reality. A depression was already visiting Harlem in the 1920s. Then the white man's depression came along. When the layoffs started, blacks were the first to go.
The selling of apples lingers with me forever. Full-grown men, some of whom I knew, some of whom were capable of holding a given job. You know, selling apples, so degrading, so sad. I didn't want to eat apples for a long time.
Black women looking for work had few choices. One was the so-called slave markets of the Bronx.
They would stand on the corner for white women who would come and decide which one they would barter and get their services for, working 6-day week, 72 hours for $15 a week. There was resentment, lots of resentment.
But for once, Harlemites seemed to have a friend in City Hall. Fiorello LaGuardia was elected mayor in 1933 on the promise that he would do something for New York's poor. Because of LaGuardia's connection with another progressive reformer, Franklin Roosevelt, New York got a big slice of the New Deal pie. But nepotism and discrimination by agencies like the Works Project Administration meant fewer jobs for the blacks of Harlem. Even in your own neighborhood, you couldn't get a job. 125th Street was called the Great White Way because not a single store along it was owned by blacks. Neither were they hired to tend the counters.
I would wonder, I said, when I get big, I wonder if I could get a job doing this. I'm sure, I think I could do this right now. But you had to wonder why there were no black people in Harlem selling something behind a counter.
The Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaign, which started in Chicago, flourished in Harlem. But when a shoe store sought an injunction, a New York State Supreme Court ruling banned the pickets. The voice of protest was silenced, and Harlem became a place of suppressed rage.
What the Depression does is it creates a person who sees, my back is against the wall. What have I to lose? I have no job. What have I to lose? I have no home. When people's backs are against the wall, their hostility becomes a little bit more dangerous.
Harlem was a tinderbox ready to explode. On March 19, 1935, it did. That afternoon, the word flashed through the streets of Harlem. A 12-year-old child had been killed at the Cress 5 and Dime for the crime of stealing a 10-cent pocket knife.
I was on my way home, and when I got down to about 127th Street, they was talking about, they killed the boy in Cress's 5 and 10 cent store. They killed the boy in Cress's 5 and 10 cent store. Being nosy, instead of going home like I should have, I started following the people. So when I got to 125th Street, the people were gathering.
When somebody threw a rock through the window of the 5 and Dime, the law stepped in.
The police came out there and started trying to bully the crowd and start shoving and pushing people, and people start shoving and pushing back. Well, they didn't have enough policemen to control that crowd. So the policemen had to give. So the crowd just went on and did what they wanted to do and said, enough is enough.
Harlem exploded. hundreds of people rampaged through the streets, breaking store windows, cursing police and merchants. Stores were burned. Gunshots, breaking glass, and police sirens pierced the night. There was widespread looting of a selective nature. Looters only raided white-owned stores.
It wasn't black people just burning their own establishments. It was not anarchy. There are instances, a Chinese store owner who comes out with a sign, me colored too. They didn't burn his store. They didn't bother black businesses contiguous to 125th Street. In some instances, they didn't even bother white businesses too far away from 125th Street. It was 125th Street that was a social cancer.
When it was all over 200 white businesses had been smashed and looted. There was more than $2 million in property damage. One suspected looter had been killed and more than 100 people injured. 100 more had been arrested. But the biggest surprise of the Harlem riot came the day after. It was Lino Rivera's reported death that had sparked the riot, but now he turned up, not only alive, but unhurt. In an interview, Rivera explained.
I went to the 5 and 10 cent store. I picked up a knife and put it in my pocket. The floor walker caught me. The police officers came, they took my name, and then they sent me home. At 2 a.m., they called for me again, and I didn't know anything about riot or anything, but they thought that I was dead.
The riot also caught Mayor LaGuardia off guard. He appointed an interracial committee to find out what had caused it. The report that the committee turned in exactly 1 year later did not blame blacks for causing the riot. It blamed job discrimination by white-owned businesses and by government agencies. To Mayor LaGuardia, this report was just too controversial.
LaGuardia suppressed the report. The report only came out publicly because it was leaked to the Amsterdam News, the black newspaper in Harlem. And it did have an effect.
With the revelation in the black press, LaGuardia's administration was finally forced to do something about Harlem. The mayor opened up more civil service jobs to blacks and used some political muscle to do the same on 125th Street, the Great White Way. Things would not really improve in Harlem until the coming of World War II meant more jobs for everyone, including black people. But the Harlem outbreak, like the shriek of a saxophone in the night, had gotten people's attention.
The Okies, the blacks, and everybody else was saying enough is enough. This government has to open up to the people. It was a whole country that was saying the same thing at the same time, but we were Harlem a little bit louder than some people.
People were howling in the South, too. Textile workers in that historically oppressed region would rise up against employers in what became the largest and bloodiest strike in the nation's history. In the shadow of the old Southern textile mills in towns like Honea-Path, South Carolina, people are still afraid to talk about what happened in 1934. Afraid or ashamed of the great labor struggle on which they waged everything but won nothing. Next to agriculture, the textile mills were traditionally the second biggest industry in the South. When farming went bad, Southerners turned in their plows for the cotton looms. It was murderous work. Machines roared in their ears, sweat ran down their bodies, and lint clung to their hair.
It just flew around, and you got sort of covered up with cotton, and especially the people that didn't work in the mill. That was their nasty word for cotton mill people. They called them lint heads.
When times got tough in the textile business, workers suffered even more. Wages that were already one of the lowest of any major industry took a dive. Workers were supposed to produce more for less. People who once handled 8 and 9 looms now worked 16 and 20. In other industries, they called it a speed-up. In textiles, it was called a stretch-out.
All of that was already there through the so-called prosperous years of the 1920s. Then came the Depression and all hell broke loose. The bottom fell out.
During the Depression, many mills closed. Owners were suffering along with their workers.
It was tough for everyone. We were all scratching and clawing like the third monkey on Noah's gangplank just to get by. As children, I can remember even playing hide and seek in the mill when it was closed.
Now in the year 1930, they don't pay nothing and they do us dirty. If we ever do manage to get ahead, it seems like all of the mills go dead. Suits us people and it serves them fine, thinking that a mill was a darn gold mine.
Finally, in 1933, textile workers thought they had a friend at the top. One of Franklin Roosevelt's first New Deal programs created the National Recovery Administration, or NRA, and established the right to organize and bargain collectively. For textile workers, it was a call to action.
People got brave. People got brave, they got courageous. They thought, well, if we have all the workers organized, then the employer can't fire all of us and still run their mills. So suddenly, instead of being powerless, because we have a union and because we're working together, maybe we can have some power over this situation.
Southerners, many of them women, poured into the textile unions. Mill owners simply ignored the unions and continued the stretch-outs. Washington did nothing. Workers took to calling the NRA the National Runaround. Southern Union delegates forced and won a strike vote. At Union headquarters in Washington, Strike Committee Chairman Francis Gorman announced the historic shutdown.
It was called because they can no longer stand the intolerable conditions in the textile mills. Because every other method has failed, the strike must now begin. It will be effective and it will succeed.
By sheer numbers, it did succeed. The morning after Labor Day, 1934, 420,000 workers walked out of the textile mills, the largest strike in U.S. history. It became famous for an innovative form of organizing, the so-called flying squadrons. In half-mile-long motorcades, strikers would caravan down back roads to mills that were still operating, coaxing workers into leaving the mills and joining the strike. Howard Pless rode with the flying squadrons.
The people wanted to come out. They told us, they hollered out the window and told us they was coming down. So we waited a while, and they did. They come out. They had to close the mill down.
In the mill towns, it was almost like a celebration. Even though people were facing desperate conditions, it was an opportunity for self-expression.
Fellow workers, we want peace and prosperity in this country here. That's what we're fighting for, and that's what we're going to have.
It was something that all of the people in charge of their local culture said is alien. That's the way Yankees behave. You know, it's not the way you are supposed to behave.
The flying squadrons were typically non-violent, but occasionally they would enter a mill to shut it down by force. Mill owners fought back with strikebreakers, local police, and the National Guard. The troopers were often textile workers themselves.
Because you're not going to stick a bayonet in somebody you know, a friend of yours or something. You don't want to stick a bayonet in nobody, as far as that's concerned, but if it's necessary, you might have to.
The New York Times described the impasse as industrial civil war. It wasn't long before the war claimed its first casualties. In Honia Path on September 6th, a fistfight at the mill broke into a full-scale riot. Deputies shot 7 strikers to death. 20 others were wounded. In Georgia, the governor imposed martial law. The National Guard imprisoned strikers in a camp that had held German prisoners of war during World War I. Northern cities were not immune. In Salesville, Rhode Island, the National Guard strung barbed wire across a cemetery to protect a mill that lay beyond. Workers hurled pieces of gravestones at the troopers, who shot back, killing 3. In addition to the National Guard, there was another enemy slowly wearing down the strikers: hunger. Union boss Francis Gorman feared the strike was falling apart in the South. Gorman saw one tantalizing hope. On September 20th, a committee that had been appointed by FDR to mediate an end to the strike issued its findings. The report was one of the weaker efforts of FDR's administration. It called for government studies of working conditions in the mills, but guaranteed nothing, not even union recognition for the workers. Gorman was trapped. If he rejected the proposal, he might lose the government's support. If he accepted it, he would betray the rank and file. The strike committee chairman hailed the proposal as an overwhelming victory. He ordered the strikers back to work. But for many of them, there was nothing to return to. FDR had urged the mills to rehire workers, but he was simply ignored. Strikers lost their jobs, their company-owned houses, and were blacklisted for life.
I think of the letter that one textile worker wrote to President Roosevelt, saying, "Mr. Roosevelt, use your big stick." Right? Here's a demand on their part that they want the federal government to come to their assistance and help them unionize, feeling very much betrayed when they did not get it.
Betrayed by their president and by Francis Gorman and the union.
More than 700 local unions. It was...
Today, textile unions are all but extinct in the South. Bitter memories and ancient prejudices are all that remain. In the 1930s, more and more Americans were experiencing the solidarity of workers' rights and the inevitable crackdown of big business and the police. A clash that would reach America's most important business, steel, and climax in one of the labor movement's darkest days. The Memorial Day Massacre of 1937. On Memorial Day in 1937, this meadow on the south side of Chicago ran with blood. 10 steelworkers were shot to death in one of the most violent confrontations in American labor history. Jerry Borazon was there that tragic holiday.
Everybody marched across the prairie up to 116th Street, and that's when we were halted by the police force. And then we heard gunshots.
They made the skeleton of modern America. The steel ribs of bridges, skyscrapers, locomotives, and battleships, snatched from the white-hot maw of a blast furnace.
Much of the work tended to be quite spasmodic in a way, sort of symbolized by the task of putting dolomite and other materials into open hearth furnaces that required the worker to take a shovelful of the material almost run to the mouth of the furnace, which was roaring hot, throw the stuff in, knowing how to keep the shovel between his face and the furnace so that he wouldn't be fried to a crisp.
Every time there was 3 whistles blowing, that meant someone was hurt. Sometimes you hear it during the night, and that was bad.
For steelworkers, danger was part of the job. What they hadn't reckoned on was the Depression. The blast furnaces growing cold.
Well, there's smokestacks with smoke and coming out of it all the time. I mean, and people were glad to see that because it was their living. But during the Depression, when they were all down, it was sad.
The life prospects for steelworkers had really had the heart cut out of them and put everybody in a very, very desperate situation.
Workers once again turned to the Union for relief from old man depression. And their union, the CIO, was making waves throughout American industry. After the famous sit-down strikes of 1936, the biggest company in the nation, General Motors, had signed with the CIO. Soon after GM caved in, U.S. Steel also threw in the towel, and all the major steel companies, collectively known as Big Steel, got in line. But to Tom Girdler, all this kowtowing to the Union was un-American, if not actual treason. Girdler ran Republic Steel, one of the so-called Little Steel companies. He had worked his way up from a sales job to president of the company. He got there by being tough on labor, which meant the routine firing, blacklisting, and beating of Union sympathizers. Girdler vowed he would raise apples and potatoes before he would give in to the Steelworkers Union.
His famous declaration was, "I will not sign a contract with that racketeering communistic CIO unless the government passes a law to make me do it." So this became the stand that they took then. They saw themselves, if you will, as sort of Horatio at the bridge, holding the line for American free enterprise.
Girdler sensed a showdown coming. In May 1937, he spent $50,000 on riot control gear to be stockpiled in the 5 Republic steel mills. The Union threw down the gauntlet with a strike order against Republic.
I see in this strike a real determination on the part of people to take their fate into their own hands because in the end they believed that there was nobody else that could make their lives better for them.
At quitting time on May 26th, steelworkers began picketing the Republic Mill on the south side of Chicago. Despite the threats from Tom Girdler, they had little anxiety about their safety. The mayor of Chicago, Edward S. Kelly, had declared the workers were within their rights to picket the mill. But the Chicago police were of a different mind. They had established a stronghold on the other side of Republic's high iron gate. The company was feeding the police free of charge, while passing out hatchet handles and gas grenades. 2 days into the strike, there was the first bloodshed. On May 28th, a group of picketers advanced across the meadow to the gates of the mill. Scenes captured in Jerry Borazan's scrapbook.
And this is the march that happened. Even the young kids are in it on their bikes, and my friend here, Diane. This is the first bloodshed.
When police halted the strikers, a small riot erupted. 3 shots were fired. No bullets found their mark, but both strikers and policemen had been injured. Undeterred, the strikers vowed to return in greater numbers. The police department caught wind of the plan and doubled its force. A small meadow on the south side of Chicago was about to become a battlefield. Memorial Day 1937 was hot and clear in Chicago. Because of the holiday, the violence of 2 days earlier seemed a distant memory. Steelworkers came to the rally with their children, bringing picnic baskets.
It was just a gorgeous sunny day, and it was on a Sunday, and there were more than 2,000 people.
A union leader called for a march to the gates of Republic Steel. Strikers formed a line and started across the prairie singing union songs.
There was one in the picket line that used to say, "Girdler is a stinker, he shall be removed," and it went on from there.
2 blocks from the plant, 260 police officers formed their own line, sweating in their heavy blue uniforms. This was no holiday for the cops.
The police went out there, first heavily armed, secondly extremely tense, as though they'd been geared up for a major confrontation.
I would say from right here, that would be about where the end of the prairie was to where the marchers were. And they were halted right there.
Strikers and police had reached an impasse. There were several tense moments. Then someone reportedly threw a tree branch at police. An officer fired his gun into the air. Marchers responded by throwing rocks. A newsreel camera recorded what happened next in graphic footage that was subsequently suppressed.
We felt a whiff of tear gas, and it blinded us. I was knocked down, and there were about 6 or 7 people on top of me. And in retrospect, that's what saved my life.
They chased retreating strikers through the fields, shooting a number of people in the back, clubbing people who were already fallen. One finds very few stories, if any, of policemen sort of showing mercy on an individual in that setting. It was as though they felt themselves in the midst of a war.
Finally, when the shots stopped, I started to get up. And I was standing up, and in total bewilderment, I looked around, and I can honestly say that is the first time in my life that I saw a battlefield.
10 strikers lay dead or dying. 30 others had been wounded. All 40 had been shot in the back or in the side. Newspaper editors immediately blamed the strikers for the Memorial Day massacre.
The major newspapers of the country overwhelmingly agreed in depicting the confrontation as one of Chicago police defending themselves from a riotous mob of people, most of whom didn't even work for the company, and probably all led by communists.
A grand jury investigation ruled the deaths were justifiable homicide. Since Paramount refused to release its newsreels, there was little evidence to the contrary. At hearings in June, Captain James Mooney defended the police department before a Senate committee.
I don't care how, if there was 10 killed, it's too bad. But if they got in there, there'd have been 200 killed. We're not killers. We're doing our plain duty there in Chicago. Chicago's a law-abiding city. There's no sit-down strikes there. They're not running away with the town. Everybody there obeys the law.
It wasn't until Senator Robert La Follette's hearings that people started to learn the true story. La Follette's Committee on Civil Liberties convened in June 1937. The committee subpoenaed the newsreels, which clearly showed Chicago policemen shooting strikers in the back. But no further action was taken against the police, who had already been cleared of wrongdoing.
Plants were running approximately full. The men were making the highest wages they ever made.
Nor did Tom Girdler have to answer to the law. In fact, Girdler became a hero in some boardrooms for his ruthless action against the strikers. Republic Steel's president had won the battle, but lost the war. Steel was once again in high demand with the coming of World War II, allowing workers to force union votes in the plants. The union won them all, even at Tom Girdler's mill. The social and labor battles of the Depression would be preempted by the worldwide conflict. The villains were no longer the heartless bank president or industrial boss. Instead, they were Tojo, Hitler, and Mussolini. During the Depression, monumental gains in the workplace were achieved that benefit us to this day. Americans who lived through that period paid dearly for those benefits, a price that can be measured in human lives. On the glass-strewn streets of Harlem, a lonely mill town in Honea South Carolina, and a blood-stained prairie in Chicago. A capitalist with a sense of humor, Malcolm Forbes, once joked that the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. In other words, be grateful you have a job. It could be worse. But during the Great Depression, millions of Americans didn't exactly see the humor in their situation. Even if they were employed, their gratitude to the boss did not overwhelm their sense of injustice in the workplace.